Thanks for joining us here on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wulfhorst. We've got a lot to talk about today. Survivor and activist Leah Juliet will be joining us to talk about the call to big tech and lawmakers for protection when it comes to online harassment and sexual violence. But first, do you know what your federal lawmakers are up to? A lot to keep track of this week as Congress is back and busy and campaigns are reaching their peak. There are just 29 days until early voting starts here in Connecticut, just a matter of weeks until residents will be casting their ballots, answering whether or not they want absentee ballots to expand and be available for all voters, and choosing who they want to be the next president of the United States, plus state capitol lawmakers to who represents us in the nation's capital. Speaking of, we mentioned they're back in session and with their own countdown, just 8 days until the budget runs out. A new one must be passed before October 1st and signed by President Biden. If not, government services will be disrupted, many essentially shutting down. No, you're not crazy if you're thinking, weren't we just doing this? The House specifically, with new Republican leadership, has gotten dangerously close to shutdowns at a historic rate recently. The process to pass spending bills is proving difficult in a divided Congress, now with pressure from presidential campaigns. As we've spoken with Connecticut's representatives, they've confirmed GOP leaders are being told by most everyone they don't want to be blamed for a government shutdown, but especially not this close to an election where they can be voted out or kept in. Former President Trump telling Speaker Mike Johnson that's what they should do if they don't get what they want, though. So what is it they want? As of taping this episode, the House has failed to pass their spending bill so far. The majority of Republicans want the so-called SAVE Act attached to that budget bill, a sticking point that's keeping it from getting through. The SAVE Act expands ID requirements to vote. It would nationally require more than just your ID at the polls, instead a passport, birth certificate, or other proof of U.S. birthplace, something Democrats and legal scholars have called unnecessary and meant to confuse and stop legal voters from casting their ballots. We saw it this past week, more than 10,000 legal Arizona voters possibly unable to take part in the upcoming election. Their registration gone. Arizona has their own version of the SAVE Act, which continuously leaves people confused or off the voter rolls, needing birthplace proof with them. Again, the SAVE Act is not law here in Connecticut or federally yet. That's why we're talking about a government shutdown in the first place. In fact, Connecticut ballots have a question this election cycle to expand voting and allow anyone to access an absentee ballot. Voter rolls are constantly changing and being gone over, though, so it is important to double check your voter registration here in Connecticut now. Make sure your address is right, your party, and while you're there, you can check your polling place hasn't changed. If you're not registered or need to re-register, change any details, here are the key deadlines and dates to keep in mind. If you want to make it easy and do so online, if you've got your driver's license, just make sure you do that before October 18th. Of course, you can register up through Election Day, but will have to do so in person at your town's designated place. And fair warning, that can take a while, so officials say register early and register now. Now, back to Congress. While the House tries to move past the SAVE Act and other resolutions snuck into the budget passage, the Senate is having to step in. Spending bills are supposed to originate in the House. The Senate doesn't want to wait for a possible shutdown, so they're putting forward their own solutions. While they were waiting for the House to act this past week, they got into a number of other issues. One with Connecticut's senators at the helm, federal protection of in vitro fertilization, or IVF. Despite a major show of support on the floor, mostly from Democrats, the bill did not pass. Republicans saying it wasn't necessary. Those championing it say the recent Alabama Supreme Court ruling on frozen embryos and the politicizing of reproductive rights over the past few years means it's needed. I spoke with Senator Richard Blumenthal and an advocate ahead of the no vote about the purpose and potential of the law. Take a look.
The Right to IVF Act is made up of 4 bills meant to ensure IVF access nationwide and make the procedure more affordable.
The Right to IVF Act really comes out of the Alabama Supreme Court's really shocking decision earlier this year to call embryos extrauterine children, essentially banning IVF in Alabama.
Rebecca Hart-Holder, president of the group Reproductive Equity Now, says her family benefited from IVF, using the procedure to have her 2 children.
It's all about who gets to start a family and when you get to start a family. It is just an extraordinary gift that we can give to families. And I hope all of the senators, whatever party they're on, will take seriously the fact that people deserve to be able to have the families they want. And if that requires medical intervention, they should be supported.
When asked about Trump's recent comments saying he supports IVF and even wants to make the procedure free for Americans, Blumenthal and Hart-Holder said,
when he says he's for IVF, but at the same time he's agreeing with groups that are against women's reproductive health rights, it's impossible to know what he really supports.
He should direct the Republican caucus to vote in favor of the Right to IVF bill. It's really that simple. If he is a man of his word, then they should take the vote in support. He's trying to say one thing publicly and then do a different thing policy-wise behind closed doors.
And that IVF protection bill did not pass Tuesday. Senators who voted yes say they'll definitely be bringing it back up again, but are worried it won't pass until after rights come more into question, as we watched IVF become part of this larger challenge to reproductive health care and what's protected. Connecticut has been updating its laws, not just with similar IVF protections proposed, but changes to abortion regulations too. The right to an abortion until 24 weeks of pregnancy is codified in Connecticut statutes, but after Roe versus Wade was overturned, state lawmakers made a point to expand related protections. Changes like the Reproductive Freedom Defense Act, letting different kinds of medical providers perform outpatient abortions, are all set since that went through the legislative process. The Department of Public Health just recently tried to make some other recommended tweaks without the necessary public hearings, though. They made it up the other week, but now there's a clear path for legal challenges. What are those changes on the table? First, removing the religious exemption provision, the clause that legally protects providers if they refuse to give a patient an abortion. They also planned to remove a line about providing care to a baby born alive after an abortion. That's because medical experts say it spreads stigma since it doesn't happen often, and when it does, a state law line like that is redundant since doctors are legally required to always provide appropriate medical care and save a life if possible. The last change they sought to make, removing some listed eligibilities for third trimester abortions. Providers saying it actually created unnecessary problems. Connecticut, like some other states, relies more on doctor recommendations and hospital approval in those emergency situations. So that's some of what the State Department of Public Health, your federal lawmakers, and others have been working on this past week. As always, you can find all of our Capitol and campaign coverage, as well as public hearing details and voter information online and on the Fox 61 News app. Still to come here, though, on The Real Story, we're talking big tech, AI, sexual harassment, and violence, plus what can be done from a policy conversation point. Stay with us.